There are various Latin American revolutions, and each kind of vary when we look into the idea of those constructs of freedom and equality. So the Haitian Revolution is really focused on equality um, and freedom. So Saint Domingue was an island that was controlled by the French. It was largely made up, over 90% of the population were slaves. Um, other people that kind of lived in this are the Maroons, or freed black men as well. So very, very small percent of people that are um, going to have any position of power in Saint Domingue. And so once news comes out that the French Revolution kind of had begun in 1789, we see that these men who had been living on this island are going to rebel. Toussaint Louverture is going to lead this rebellion. He had previously been a slave. Now he was freed at this point, and he leads and is pretty successful. But he kind of leads this movement in 1801, and then shortly after, the French have come in and tried to attempt to thwart this rebellion, because it was a big sugar colony and it provided a lot of profit for France. So they arrest Toussaint. He is taken back to France, which is where he will die. But the um, revolution continues, and as Napoleon kind of gains power and is forced to deal with European countries challenging him as he's trying to create an empire in Europe, and he realizes he just really can't do that in the Americas, he lets go. And in 1804, Haiti declares its independence. Now, this is, again, a challenge of freedom and equality in the sense that the vast majority of the population was enslaved. And, when France is pursuing this idea of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, that there should be equality granted in France, this idea goes to the Americas, and its colony, or those that were a part of its colony, hear this and rebel because they hear about this. The problem is that Haiti may gain its independence, but now you have a group of people who have never led a country. And even when Toussaint had actually gained a position, he kind of implemented that idea of sharecropping, where you might be free, but you're still going to work, and in a sense, kind of implemented a policy very similar to slavery, in that this is what our economy is based off of, and you can't, like, you still have to maintain this presence in order to be economically sufficient. And so people kind of identify him as, is he a hero or is he a villain? Because he might have been heroic in trying to lead this movement for freedom, but he still kind of treated and mistreated individuals in society. So they gain freedom, they gain equality, in that there's no more slavery, but Haiti is never really able to recover. It's never really going to be economically sufficient. You still see a huge amount of people who struggle. And you start seeing that different groups of people will establish control and maintain control through a lot of corruption and violence. So while that idea of freedom, or that idea of equality, existed, at what cost? And is it true freedom if you're still confined to harsh treatment and this inability to really seek a lot of progress or see a lot of progress? The other Latin American revolutions vary, but many of them are focused on this idea of political and social inequalities. So when Spain had kind of come in and taken control over the various territories, it set up this social class system that we've briefly talked about. At the top are the Peninsulares. They hold true control. They were Spaniards that were born in Spain that came to the Americas. So think of like Hernan Cortez. The Peninsulares' children were Creoles. So they were born in Spanish territory. So they had Spanish parents, but they were born in the territories, so in the Americas. So the Peninsulares hold the power. Creoles are their children. Mestizos and mulattoes are going to be at this next level. And mestizo means that you have one parent who is Spanish and one parent who is indigenous or Native American. A mulatto is a parent that is Spanish and a parent that is a slave. Um, Beneath that, you have the indigenous populations, and then you have the enslaved populations. So really what you see that kind of happens in Latin America is that the Creoles are becoming more and more frustrated with their political inequality and their social inequality. So kind of these rebellious children in a sense. It's not the mestizos necessarily, it's not the mulattoes or the indigenous populations or the enslaved populations that are rising up, it's the Creoles. So again, where you see the American Revolution or the English Revolution, it's those that are of elite status wanting more power. It's not really this movement for social progress or social change for the majority of the population. So one of the things that leads into a problem is that when Napoleon took control and was expanding his empire, he inputs when he has conflict with Spain, he ends up putting his own brother Joseph as the leader or as the monarch for Spain. Well, this kind of sets off this series of events in Latin America where people challenge this idea of no, like we already were frustrated with being a colony. We already are frustrated with the idea that our parents or whoever, are controlling the nations. And so these Creoles begin these movements to kind of challenge and push for independence or freedom as a state from Spain. But again, it's the Creoles who are wanting more power for themselves. So Simon Bolivar, who was from Venezuela, is going to kind of lead this movement, and he's exiled twice, but he is going to gain independence and march into Colombia and moves this or is able to gain independence for Venezuela and for Colombia. Jose San Martin is going to be from Argentina, who's a Creole. They're both Creoles. He had fought for independence for Argentina, was able to get that in 1816, led the movement for Chile to get its independence in 1817. And so eventually he kind of moves, and San Martin and Bolivar are going to meet in Ecuador. And when they meet, they kind of realize that they should kind of lead or champion this movement for independence movements. And again, they're Creoles. And so, for whatever reason, San Martin allows his troops to follow Bolivar. And they basically move to get most of Latin America and its countries free from Spain. Um, Bolivar has this idea of the Grand Colombia, which is supposed to kind of be a united confederation of Latin American states, in a similar means that you would have seen like the United States of America. It works initially, but then falls apart. So again, these Latin American revolutions are motivated by this attempt to gain political equality for the Creoles with the Peninsulators. It's not a movement necessarily for progress. It is freedom as a state, but it's again kind of this context that's important. Mexico is a little bit different. So the Mexican Revolution is led by Miguel Hidalgo, who is a priest, and he was fighting for social equality for those that were of the lower classes. So this is a shift. It's not a Creole-led movement. It is one that is led by the lower classes. But Hidalgo is going to ring the bells at the church, and this is supposed to signal this movement to fight for independence. Um, and he kind of gains this group of like 80,000 people that start marching, but he's defeated, and pretty quickly he's killed. And so Jose Morelos is going to continue fighting after Hidalgo, but he is also defeated, and he is defeated by a Creole, Augustine de Iturbide, who was initially successful and was in support of the Spanish government and kind of maintaining control. However, he hears that there's potentially going to be a change in his position, that Creoles are going to potentially lose their position of power. And so he switches sides. And Augustine de Iturbide is going to fight kind of alongside those lower classes because he himself doesn't want to lose his elite status And so where it had initially been a movement for truly for the lower classes, now you've got a Creole leading it. So there's questionable concerns there. So he initially leads it. He is successful, but he kind of establishes a dictatorship, and so he is pulled from his position because of that kind of corruption. And then Mexico, again, while it may gain independence, it's going to struggle economically, and so you're going to see a lot of dictators or corrupt leaders that establish control, and then shortly, not long after, well, I guess it's almost 100 years, uh, another revolution. So again, we've got equality, but at what cost? So Brazil is also one that really should be kind of separate in itself, and there's not too much that you need to really know here. But when Joseph Bonaparte was given his position of control over Spain, the Portuguese family, the Portuguese royal family, John the Sixth, is going to flee and sets up his palace and his control in Brazil because Portugal had control over Brazil. And so eventually the family is able to return back home, but his son, John's son, Dom Pedro, is going to stay in Brazil. And they get frustrated. Excuse me, they get frustrated that the potential is that the Brazil will remain a colony under Portugal because they had kind of under John's rule while there not been recognized as a colony, but kind of had recognized some independence. So in 1822, the Creoles demand that political equality and independence. And so they're willing to allow Dom Pedro to rule, but they want independence. So you still see the Creoles kind of leading, but it's a very different revolution than what you would have seen previously. So kind of that separation from those others. And they don't necessarily all work together because you have some that are fighting or pursuing these policies of political equality of the wealthy, but then Mexico is pursuing policies among the social classes, really kind of championing the lower classes. So there are some differences and overall changes there. So the effects is that the Creoles do gain more positions of power, but then social inequalities continue to exist for years. And again, many of those countries are going to struggle politically and economically when they gain independence because they had not been able to rule. So where, with North America or with the colonies, the 13 colonies, there had been a lot of self-rule. There had not been in Latin America. So once that freedom is given, they're going to struggle. And you still see in 2019 a lot of these countries are struggling because they become economically dependent. And when we get into imperialism, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But you might have seen some political equality, but the social inequalities continue, and the freedoms aren't really there because the country is struggling so much, and you start seeing those corrupt dictators take over.